Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Blue Collar DM. My name is Howard and today we're actually going to be talking about the thing that Dungeons & Dragons is the most known for, and that is combat. And we're going to talk about basically how to run it, the general rules and mechanics of how combat works, and what you can expect when you run it in your first time game. Let's get to it. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, when does combat start? And basically it starts when the Dungeon Master says, roll for initiative. Well, why would the Dungeon Master say roll for initiative? There's a couple different reasons. Either you guys find a monster that you need to fight that is going to attack you, or a monster finds you and you don't even know it's there. So the DM says roll for initiative. So how does initiative work? Well, if you're a Dungeon Master and you need to track it yourself, this is how it basically goes. You roll a d20, you add the initiative modifier for your character sheet if you're a player, or the monster stat block if it's a monster. That number determines the order of combat and how it works. Now, generally speaking, most things are going to be less than 20, but occasionally there might be a player who has an above 20 modifier, which happens. So basically what you want to do as a Dungeon Master is kind of record from highest number to lowest number down on a piece of paper and write down what that number was. Because there are occasions when playing Dungeons & Dragons that things happen on initiative count 20. Now that we have these initiative numbers, we can actually understand what turns everyone goes in over the course of combat. Each round of combat actually takes 6 seconds. So one time through the whole entire initiative order is actually only 6 seconds in real-time gameplay. Alright, so now we have a good understanding on how the turn order is determined when we're fighting in Dungeons & Dragons and in combat. So what can we do on our turns? Well, as a player, or even if you're the Dungeon Master and you have monsters to manage, there are a few things that you can do. So on your turn, you have the options of doing basically 3 things. One of those things on your turn is actually your movement. So if we look at our character sheet in the movement section, generally speaking, most creatures can move 30 feet. Some can move a little bit more, some move a little bit less, but in general, we see that number there. So let's say it's 30. If you're playing on grid paper, that's 6 squares on a grid paper. But if you're not and you're just playing Theater of the Mind, just think of it as about 30 feet in distance in your brain, and you kind of just manage the combat in that way. The next thing that we can do is they can actually take what's called an action. So there are a lot of things that you can do with your action, believe it or not. And the list is exhaustive, but basically what you can do is you can do any action that is explained in your character abilities section on your character sheet. A good example of this might be Second Wind or something like along those lines, depending on what character class you are. Another thing you can do is attack, which most people are used to. Now, if we're attacking, there's a couple of different rules and mechanics that kind of come into play here. So if you're a melee character or you're fighting with, say, a sword or something like that, generally speaking, you have to be right next to a creature in order to hit it. There are occasions where weapons have reach, which basically means that you can be a little bit further away and still hit somebody. Think of somebody maybe with like a really long pole arm that can reach really far. That's a good example of a weapon with reach. The other thing that we can do other than a melee attack is what's called a ranged attack. So there are certain weapons that are ranged weapons. Think your short bows and long bows and crossbows and that kind of thing. Now, with these ranged weapons, there are certain rules. Generally speaking, if you're right up next to somebody in technically melee range, you're actually trying to hit somebody with disadvantage, because the idea being that because you're so close, you're distracted by the character in front of you and you have to roll 2 d20s and take the lowest number after adding your attack modifier to see if you hit. Now, if you're beyond that, right next to somebody, then you can actually roll at a normal roll. Now, depending on the weapon itself, there are certain rules. For example, certain ranged weapons have certain ranges. So let's say that we're trying to fire something with a 80-foot range. So anytime we shoot within 80 feet, with the exception of being right next to somebody, we can roll at a normal roll. Roll that d20, add your modifier, and see if you hit. If we're beyond that range, you'll actually see what is called a secondary range on your character sheet, which is actually the long range. Anytime you fire in long range, you actually roll at disadvantage. So say we have that case where 80 feet is normal range and then 320 is our long range. So anything beyond 80 feet but less than 320 feet, we roll at disadvantage like we would if we were right up next to somebody, because something further away is going to be much harder to hit than it is at your normal range. So again, we roll 2 d20s, we take the smaller one, add our attack modifier, and see if we hit. The other thing that we can do with our action is actually cast a spell. So if you cast a spell that has a casting time of 1 action, you can cast that spell with your action on your turn. We'll get into in another episode on how magic is different and kind of unique in every given scenario in another video. Another thing that you can do on your turn with your action is activate or use an object. So a good example of this would be to drink a health potion. You can also help on your turn as your action. So say you want to help one of your fellow party members hit something else, you can provide some sort of help or aid to them. A good example of this is trying to distract an enemy, so that way your partner in your party can actually attack that enemy with advantage, which in our case, it's kind of like disadvantage, except you roll the 2d20s, you take the highest. So if you want that one particular character to hit something, you can actually provide a help action on your turn in order to help that character have advantage on their next attack. Another thing you can do on your turn is hide, which there are specific reasons and specific stealth mechanics and why you would want to hide on your turn as an action. But the best example is for rogues, if they don't already have a special ability that lets them use the hide action as a bonus action, they want to hide in order to be able to gain advantage on their attack. Another thing that actually uses the attack action as part of your action are actually the grapple and shove actions. And basically what those are contested strength checks to see if you can either grapple your opponent and hold them still or shove them 5 feet away from you. You can also dash on your action. So dashing basically means you can then take your action to move your movement as an action. So in a way, you can actually use your movement on your turn, then take the dash action to then move again that same amount of movement. So if you need to cover some ground really fast, really quickly, that's a reason why you want to use the dash action. Another thing you can do on your turn is actually disengage. And disengaging is a mechanic that comes into play when you're actually in melee with a character and you want to move away. There's actually certain things that you can do in order to hit somebody that tries to run away from you, and we'll actually get into that a little bit later. But basically you take the disengage action so that way you don't get hit with an attack because you're running away. Another action you can take on your turn is the dodge action, and basically what that means, if someone tries to hit you with a melee attack, they have to do so at disadvantage because you're actively trying to get out of the way. You can also take the search action, which in combat isn't typically seen, but on occasion you might have to use it in certain scenarios. And then the last thing you can actually do is ready an action as an action. And what that means is that you can actually hold, say, an attack or something else like a spell for a given trigger later on in the combat. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so the next thing that you can do on your turn is a bonus action. Now, bonus actions aren't really used too much depending on what kind of character you're playing, but in certain scenarios, it's utilized. So one thing you can actually use as a bonus action is a bonus action character ability. Now, these comes in different shapes and sizes, but check your player's handbook or your character sheet to see if you have any of these. Another thing you can use your bonus action for is a bonus action attack. Now, a lot of characters don't really get this bonus action attack, but sometimes you do. And there's certain scenarios and certain cases, like say if you're holding 2 daggers, you can use your bonus action to attack again with the offhand. And that's a scenario where you'd use it. And the last thing you can use your bonus action for is actually a spell. The bonus action spells, like say a healing word, for example, are ways that you can actually use a spell as a bonus action. Now, if you cast a bonus action spell and you want to use another spell as your action, there's actually a specific case where this can happen. And that is, if you use a bonus action spell like a healing word, the only other thing you can do on your turn as an action is cast a cantrip. You can't also cast another leveled spell. And we'll get into kind of magic and levels of spells in another video. Another thing you can kind of do on your turn generally is a free action, which is actually picking up or dropping a weapon. These are actions that aren't really utilized all that much, but they're basically for something that it doesn't really cost you a lot to do. Like, for example, drop a weapon on the ground or pick up a weapon on the ground. It doesn't take a whole lot of time. In that 6-second span of your turn, it's not really that big of an impact, but there are certain cases. And if you need any more resources on that specifically, you can check the basic standard rules document or your player's handbook. Now, the other thing you can actually do during a combat round is actually use your reaction. And this is actually something that goes back to what we were talking about in the actions section of this video. So one thing you can actually utilize your reaction for is a reaction character ability, like some of the other ones that we talked about. Like if on your character sheet you have a specific reaction you can use as a character ability, this is where it comes into play. Another thing you can use reaction for is actually a reaction attack. So if a character tries to leave your range when they were in melee range with you and they try to run away, this is where you can actually use your reaction to use an opportunity attack. You can only get your reaction once per turn, so once you use it, you use it. But if a character tries to run away from you, you can actually use your reaction to hit them as they run away. which is why the disengage action exists, so that way you can actually leave a person's range without actually having to get hit. But at the same time, still uses your action. So there is a cost to be able to use that disengage action. Another thing you can use reaction for is actually a reaction-based spell. So a good example of this is Shield. Shield is a spell that is actually utilized in order to kind of shield yourself from an incoming attack as a reaction. So, depending on the scenario, let's say you're a wizard and you get attacked and you want to boost your AC, you cast Shield as your reaction on your turn, so that way you can deflect that attack and you don't get hit. But again, we've used a reaction, so we can't then recast another reaction spell. So if we wanted to use a spell like Counterspell, which, again, we'll talk about magic in another video, but basically, we wouldn't be able to use it again. And then the last thing you can use a reaction for is any held action that we used on our action turns. So let's say we decided to hold our action to hit something when it decided to come in range of our melee. We can actually then use that held action to attack that particular monster. So now that we know what we can do on our turn during combat, when does combat end? Well, generally speaking, combat ends when initiative ends. And when does initiative end? Well, it depends. If all the enemies in the particular scenario are either dead or incapacitated, that can be the end of combat. There is nothing else to fight, and the player characters have beaten that encounter. Another thing that would cause combat to end is some certain event that would cause an end to combat. So a good example is maybe one of the player characters tried to talk to that enemy to see if they could negotiate a way to end combat, so that way they didn't attack each other anymore. Or maybe there was a magical effect that caused the players to get translocated somewhere else in the world all of a sudden, and combat ended. Maybe the enemies ran away. Maybe the player characters ran away. There's a lot of reasons why combat can end, but basically, combat ends when initiative ends. Now that you know how combat works, why it starts, why it ends, or when it ends, and the different things that you can do on your turn as either the Dungeon Master with the monsters that you have, or as the player characters with your character sheets and what the actions and bonus actions are on those character sheets, the only thing you really need to do now is go out and play. If you have any other questions about combat or anything else Dungeons & Dragons, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below. I'm also going to leave a link to the standard rules documents, so that way you guys can look into some of the more nitty-gritty of general combat mechanics. But other than that, you're ready to go, and the only thing you need to do now is go out and play. Until next time, see you guys soon.